Hi, welcome to the video for EDF4004 on Topic 7, How Does Policy Affect You? Now, part of this unit is really looking at curriculum and assessment and policy. And this week we'll really discuss about policy and particularly in relation to how it affects us. Now, a lot of times, and there's a lot of literature to talk about this, that teachers don't necessarily feel like they feel like they often kind of are told what to do, that policy is kind of implemented and teachers are just asked to passively stand by and implement it, I guess. But it's actually a lot more complex than that. And I think increasingly teachers are finding that they take an active part in that policies is often given at maybe the government level, and then teachers and schools enact policy in various ways. So they interpret and they translate that policy in different ways to try to better meet the needs of their students. And I think this is a really important thing, is that we actually do policy as teachers all the time, because we have to interpret the policies that may come up from higher up. We interpret those and we translate into our own practices. And sometimes we negotiate those, sometimes we resist, sometimes we do this based on also how students react to it. So this is an important thing to understand as a teacher. The other thing that's really important to understand is that as pre-service teachers, you are also part of this policy process. And in many ways, recently with the land tight and the TPA, while you've in some ways been the object of policy, it's important to understand that we understand where those kind of policies are coming from, what that's saying about education. So that's what we'll kind of discuss slightly in this lecture, but because I want to make sure it's under 10 minutes so that it's not too long, I'm going to fly through it. All right, so I wanted to briefly talk about federal versus state. And I think just some of these kind of overriding questions I think is important to think about. Is education the responsibility of states or territories or the federal government? And what about schools? How accountable are they in regards to things like funding? In the virtual tutorials, we'll talk a little bit about funding and Gonski, because that's been a huge thing within Australia in discussing views in regards to funding. We know that in Section 51 of the Australian Constitution, education is the responsibility of the states or territories. And I think this is really interesting because we see this at the moment with COVID-19, particularly here in Victoria, as we see this tension between decisions made at the federal from the Prime Minister, and then also here in Victoria, and we see this tension. And what happens often is that there's imbalance, because the federal government has the ability to raise revenue, yet the state has the obligation to provide services. So we've seen this just recently as well in the media in regards to private schools or independent schools, that the federal government has kind of provided an incentive for private schools to go back earlier, which kind of has created a tension, obviously, with the Victorian government, because they have a different kind of idea of when schools will go back for the local schools or the government schools. But because the federal government has the money to kind of provide that incentive, this is where that it's not quite as clear cut as saying, well, education is the responsibility of the states. There are still incentives that are given by the federal government, which provides, again, sometimes a healthy tension, and sometimes that tension does become imbalanced at times. We also see this, even though that education is the responsibility of the states, we see a bigger kind of presence of the federal government in teaching and education more generally. Professional standards is kind of slightly new for Australia, and when they created these professional standards, this was done by AITSL, which is a federally appointed group of people, so organization. So that is a federal initiative, and that was to kind of provide standards across the states and territories. So again, that takes it not just about education within each state, but it's more federally mandated. So these professional standards and as well as the curriculum, is to kind of unify and make sure that there's this same standards across all states. And we see this, the Teacher Education Ministerial Advisory Group, or also known as TMAG, provided recommendations in 2014. And again, this was a federally appointed group. And in this group, they provided a lot of recommendations on how to improve education. And one aspect was improving teacher education, which now we've seen the introduction of Landtite and the teacher performance assessment as ways to ensure teacher quality within Australian schools. So the point of this is to help you understand that yes, education is the responsibility of the states, but it's not quite as simple as that. There's a big federal push at the moment to kind of put a lot of educational kind of goals and so on as a federal priority, which sometimes can provide that tension between state and the federal government. I'm going to give you another example just from a project that I did a couple of years ago, and this was on education for sustainability. And what happened was that it was in 2009 when there was the global financial crisis, and what happened was that we had federal funding that provided a whole bunch of money. It's called the Solar Schools Project, to schools to do things like get solar panels and so on. But one of the things that they had to do was have a smart meter so that they could create benefits. So it would basically provide data on, how much solar the school was using, how much gas, how much electricity, and this was supposed to be kind of turned into educational benefits so that the schools would be using this smart meter or this data to also improve for educational purposes. So here again, federal funding came in, and it was available for the schools and all the states and territories, and the schools could ask for this funding. But one of the things that we found in our research was that actually very few schools knew about the program. So they obviously got the federal funding, but there were very few teachers that actually knew about the smart meter program and knew that there was all this data there to be used in their classrooms. So this kind of let us know that there wasn't a lot of accountability for schools to actually use it as educational resource. And while this whole point of this was to kind of make sure that we were implementing sustainability with our schools, it became more of a tangible resource. So obviously schools could manage their particularly like the business officers would say things like, if there was a leak in the school, they obviously knew that because of the smart meter. So it helped the school financially, but it wasn't really used for educational purposes. So here again, we see federal funding coming in, but not having as many local benefits as they could. Another thing, particularly with the thing of accountability, is English as an additional language. Often the way that it works is that if there is a student, in particular if there's a larger group of students that have that require English as an additional language support, there is money that is provided per student. But oftentimes what happens, like, where does this money go? Like, schools have the ability to choose how that money is used. So they might be using it for teachers, they might for EAL specific teachers, or they might be using it for other things. So, there's this this really complex tension between, we don't want to say every single penny has to be accounted for. It becomes so bureaucratic, but at the same time, you want to make sure that there's some accountability. And so these are the tensions that are in education at the moment. Our most kind of recent report was the Through Growth to Achievement report. And this was kind of building on the Gonski, so the funding report, about how do we spend needs-based funding. So how do we actually do this to ensure that we're prioritizing education and going forth as a strong educational, a country with a strong education system. So there were kind of three priorities. The first one was deliver at least 1 year's growth in learning for every student each year. So the idea that students can come in from a variety of different levels. So you may have a student who's in year 9, but they are working at a year 7 level in various things. Equip every student to be creative, connected, and engaged, and an engaged learner in a rapidly changing world. Cultivate an adaptive, innovative, and continuously improving education system. Now, what I find really interesting about all policies, and this is this is just the nature of policies, they're very aspirational, but how this actually is, how these 3 priorities are actually implemented, or what we say enacted, and how they're actually translated into schools is very different and will be different for each school. And you'll find this as well as you go into schools next year as teachers, is that every school experience is so different. They will interpret policies and these guidelines, and they will use it for their particular school, and it may look very, very different. Some of the recommendations were laying the foundations for learning. So this idea of quality early learning, also really kind of those connections with parents and encouraging self-regulation in students. Equipping every student, and this is the key one, equipping every student to grow and achieve in a changing world. And so this policy was actually looking at introducing new reporting with a focus on learning attainment and learning gain. If you looked at some of the reports in the resource folder, you would see that some that tried to show progress. So that's a real focus now, is ensuring. Now Victoria's already done that with looking at things as, it's never about, so the Victorian curriculum has always been about levels, so that there's learning levels instead of year levels. And that's one of the things that they're trying to revise the Australian curriculum now, is to try to look at things as learning progressions rather than, year levels. And so this idea that you can, as long as you're moving from, even if you're in year 9, but as long as you're moving from level 8 to level 9 in something and you have a year's growth, that's the key thing. So focusing on gain, learning gain, a year's learning gain, rather than being at a certain standard at a certain time. And obviously a big focus on foundational skills in literacy and numeracy, which will probably have, the reason for that is because of the declining scores in PISA, which, focus on literacy and numeracy skills, and really trying to beef that up a bit more. There's some other recommendations, and that's creating pathways for teachers. So, through professional development, inductions for early career teachers. So that's really key for most of you. Also empowering and supporting school leaders. So making sure that, people, when you get into schools, you don't just kind of go, okay, well, I'll teach for 30 years and do the same thing, but how can we create pathways for leadership? Raising and achieving aspirations through innovation and continuous improvement. And that's where a lot of online learning was set to come in, which is really interesting in light of current events, is that we've kind of, had to rush to really think about how we use online learning as a way to help our students learn. So one of the questions I want to ask in this is, how do we make teaching a more desired and or respected profession? A lot of educational policies have kind of key things. Obviously, we want our education system to be really strong. And this can be looked at, how do we improve students' learning? How do we ensure that students are learning and they're improving, and ultimately that they are competitive in regards to other students? So we're looking at international benchmarks. So how is Australia, how do they sit in the midst of the rest of the world? So how do we ensure that? Well, one of the things is teachers. How do we make sure that teachers are high quality? And that's where you see things like Landtite. And literacy and numeracy tests have been used in other countries, like in Finland, but for a different reason. For Finland, they had so many applicants. They use these kind of tests to kind of help narrow it down to 800 positions. In Netherlands as well, but they were trying to encourage second career teachers, so they were using a literacy and numeracy test as an alternative pathway. The UK has also used literacy and numeracy tests for their qualified teacher status, but interestingly, recently they've decided to assess literacy and numeracy skills in a different way. So you see these kind of international trends. But ultimately, all these countries are trying to make sure that teaching is a desired profession. But we have these different kind of waves of like lots of teachers or shortage. So shortage, too many, and supply, and trying to kind of manage this, and all within this idea, we really want high quality teachers. But how do we get high quality teachers into teacher education and then in schools? And so, there's a lot of different kind of ideas, and we'll talk more about this within our tutorials about, is having a Landtite, a test, a literacy and numeracy test, the best way to kind of identify high quality teachers? How do we do this? What's the best way around it? There's a video, if you get a chance, it's about practice schools, and this is in Finland, and how they actually, and I love this idea, that actually through their teacher education program, they do all their placements in a practice school. And so it's, it's highly connected to their placements and so on. All right, so I didn't quite get to under 10 minutes, but just make sure you're on track to submit your report in your conference by the 7th of June. And if you are planning to do your conference live, you will do this in your normal tutorial time, but make sure you communicate this with your tutor because he or she will set up a time for you to do that. All right, thanks for listening. Bye.